Welcome. For those of you who don't know me, my name is Dora Jandrić. I work as an equality, diversity, and inclusion methodologist at the NIHR Research Support Service at Newcastle University and Partners. But today I'm here in my capacity as a deputy chair of the Research Inclusion Network. And I'm very happy to introduce our speaker today, Dr. Kevin Guyon. Kevin is a writer and researcher whose work explores the intersection of data and identity. He's the author of Rainbow Trapped, Queer Lives, Classifications and the Dangers of Inclusion, and Queer Data Using Gender, Sex and Sexuality Data for Action. Kevin is a Chancellor's Fellow at the University of Edinburgh and the director of the Gender Plus Sexuality Data Lab. And before I hand over to Kevin, I would just like to go over some housekeeping rules for today, which are just your basic turn your microphones off so we don't have any interference during the presentation. During the slides, feel free to keep your cameras off. Once we get to the Q&A towards the end, it will be great to see your faces if that's okay with you when you ask questions. Raise your hand if you want to ask a question or just pop them in the chat. I'll keep an eye on the chat to see if there's any questions while Kevin gives his presentation, and just be kind and respectful. If you don't agree with someone, listen, we can have a discussion, but we won't tolerate any violence. So I will hand over to Kevin now, and yeah, I'll be here if you need anything.
Thank you, Dora. So hopefully my slides are just booting up. So hopefully you can all see a lovely jazzy rainbow slide with no speaking notes. Fantastic. Well, thank you so much for the invite to come and join you this afternoon. I know that Dora and I, we have kind of shared research interests in this space, so it's a real great opportunity to come along and share with you some insights from my work and my research around this topic. So I want you to get excited. This afternoon, I'm going to be talking all about diversity policies, equality monitoring forms, drop-down lists, and survey response options. The many moments across our life, across our research, across our practice, where we put ourselves into a box, and how the terms we use to describe us, how these same terms often come to define us. So with that in mind, I want to start this kind of online talk a little bit differently. I'm not sure how well this works online. We'll see how it goes. But I'd like you to do so, if you're able to do so, wherever you're joining us from in the UK or around the world, to just raise your hand if you've done any of the following three things when completing a survey or a piece of research about gender, sex and sexuality. So when you've been asked a question on this topic, hands up if you've ever ticked the prefer not to say box. Okay, keep your hands in the air and add another hand if you've ever ticked the other box when completing a survey or a diversity monitoring form. I'm seeing lots of hands popping up in the chat. And thirdly, and maybe most interestingly, if you've ever ticked the free text write-in box. Okay, I can see many arms raised on the call. Thank you for that. Now that's for me really interesting because I describe all of you who had their hands in the air as what I describe as box breakers. So that's a really key idea from my talk today, this idea of box breakers. Now they're really interesting for my research because box breakers live outside the narrow demands of gender, sex and sexuality categories. Box breakers are the residue of design practices. What's left behind after everyone else is sorted into neat and tidy categories. So in my research, I'm talking about the bisexual with a partner of a different gender, the questioning queer, the person who just wants to avoid all labels, and the many, many others who fall between categorical cracks. Importantly, for this talk around gender and sexuality, I'm also talking about straight and cisgender people who find themselves constrained by the narrowness of the options made available to them. Now, in my talk today, I'm going to think through this idea of box breakers in a few different ways and how box breakers complicate easy assumptions we make about the design and implementation of diversity policies and the use of data to collect and monitor questions around gender, sex and sexuality. Box breakers also highlight how the old ways of working, so these traditional mainstream approaches to counting and categorizing gender, sex and sexuality, are no longer fit for purpose. So right now we are living through a revolution of identity categories. There are more box breakers today than ever before, and research suggests there'll be a lot more box breakers in the future. So if anyone on the call today does any work, particularly with kind of younger communities, kind of Gen Z, younger populations, you might be aware that data is showing that among younger people aged 18 to 24, there's a heterosexual minority among adults in this group, with just 41% identifying as exclusively heterosexual. However, we're not simply identifying as completely homosexual either, with most growth among categories such as bisexual, polysexual, pansexual, and queer. So what really interests me about box breakers is that they do two things. Firstly, they actively resist the categories assigned to them. So for all of us who had their hands in the air at the start of my talk, when you say no to the choices presented, you're not just being awkward or difficult, but you're challenging the narrow options made available to you. Secondly, box breakers are really important for our work because by choosing not to put themselves into a category, they disrupt the entire system. I've been trying to find visuals to kind of speak to this point. GIFs of cats and cardboard boxes did a really good job of demonstrating what happens here. How box breakers destroy the box they're forced into, how they get in that box, in that category, and they move it around, or they break the rules about what a box should contain. My point here is that box breakers undo the rules of classification systems. Okay, so to recap, box breakers, they do two things. They resist categories available to them. And secondly, when forced into a category not of your choosing, your incongruity breaks the entire system. You reveal it to be a charade, something designed. Okay, when I do these online talks, I like to start with a bit of a bang and then take a few steps back and say a bit more about who I am and my background and why I'm joining you on this kind of call today. So yes, I work as something called a Chancellor's Fellow at the University of Edinburgh. It's a job title that doesn't make sense to anybody outside of the University of Edinburgh, but basically a job that involves research teaching at the university. I joined the university 2 years ago. Before that, I worked for some years at the University of Glasgow. And prior to that, I did a PhD in history back in 2016. After doing the PhD, I thought academia, it's not for me. I kind of very quickly left that space and worked for 5 years doing equality, diversity, and inclusion work. Since joining the University of Edinburgh, I run something called the Gender and Sexuality Data Lab, which launched last year. So this is a space for critical work around gender, sex, and sexuality data. It's a hub for researchers, practitioners, artists, and activists to kind of come together to think critically about kind of cutting edge work in this space. We organise everything from kind of industry summits through to last week in Manchester, we had a queer data cabaret, which was a huge amount of fun. If you're interested in finding out more, please check out our website. And I think common to all this work, kind of what's always sparked my interest, whether it's kind of in history, in my kind of DEI work, in my current work around data, what's always sparked my interest is what happens at that intersection where different data practices, so it might be how we collect data, how we analyze it, how we use it, what happens when they intersect with questions of identity. So my work particularly looks at gender, sex, and sexuality, but I'm sure there's many overlaps between other questions around race, ethnicity, social class, disability, age. The same types of questions I'm asking can apply in those contexts as well. More broadly, I'm interested in thinking about who benefits and who loses when we collect, analyse, and use data about minoritized communities. And how do our decisions about data, so what to count, how to count, who to count, how do they invite differential harms for marginalized groups? So in my talk today, I'm going to be pulling out ideas and threads from my two books on this topic, Queer Data, which published in 2022, and Rainbow Trap, which published in hardback last summer and came out excitingly in paperback last week, are going to be the kind of the works I'm engaging with here. And this is a plan of action. I'm going to speak for about kind of maybe 20, 25 minutes more, and this is what I'm going to cover in my talk today. Okay, let's kick things off. Let's get more into the substance of the talk today. What's understood as a problem or the problem when it comes to data on LGBTQ communities? In my work, I find it really helpful to think about problems and solutions and the relationship between what's seen as a problem and how that invites certain types of solutions. And when it comes to data on LGBTQ communities, we often see the problem or understand the problem as being about missing data or misrecognition. So when something goes wrong with our methods, with our initiatives, with our programs, we often see this as being a problem around the tools we use, the approaches, or the practices we've adopted. These assumptions can mean that people's gender, sex, and sexuality are categorized in ways at odds with how they wish to see themselves in the world. And we see that happening in online, digital spaces, as well as kind of offline spaces around passports, ID cards, those types of things. In my book, I highlight one example to kind of bring this idea to life, and that is somebody called Jamie Liang, who was about to catch a train from London St Pancras to Brussels when they found themselves at the sharp edge of a classification system. So at the security checkpoint at the train station, Jamie beeped when passing through. However, rather than instantly being patted down, the guards demanded to see Jamie's passport. The guards explained in front of all the other travellers that they were unsure if Jamie was a man or a woman and wanted to confirm his sex before assigning someone to pat him down. Now, this story is really insightful in a few ways because it highlights how classification systems, particularly those based on binary gender and encoded with racialized assumptions, how they create sites of danger when individuals complicate the rules of the design. And how membership of a category, man, woman, male, female, enables and constrains what a person can do in the social world, how they go about moving through life. What's also important here is that our understanding of the problem shapes the types of solutions we see as being possible. So that relationship between problems and solutions. So if the problem is understood to be around missing data or misrecognition, the solution that follows is that we just have to add more LGBTQ people into the mix. So that's kind of the story we're told about how we fix this problem. And arguably the most high profile data project around this kind of additive approach is adding more data into the mix are the national censuses. So I'm not going to talk about it too much today. I'm a huge census nerd. It's not a talk on the census today. But it's a really interesting moment to be doing this work around LGBTQ data because in 2021 and 2022, censuses in the UK asked new questions on sexual orientation and a question on gender identity or trans status, as it was called in Scotland. So for the first time, there is now kind of national census data on the size of the LGBTQ population. On the screen, you can see the data for England and Wales, reporting 3.2% of the population identifying as lesbian, gay, bisexual, or sexual orientation other than heterosexual, and 0.5% identifying as trans. I'm not going to get into detail here. There is variation across the UK. There's variation across types of questions were asked, but just to highlight the existence of kind of national level data on these populations. Ahead of today's talk, I like to do a bit of digging, kind of rooting around the organisation where I speak. I had a little look at NAHR's data on kind of breakdown by funding applications, who's applying for funding awards, how is that broken down by different demographic characteristics. As far as I could tell, there wasn't any data on sexual orientation, but you can see here kind of a breakdown on who's applying for funding awards by age, disability, ethnicity, and sex. However, as I've argued in my work, with something like the census, which has these new questions, it's more inclusive than it was before, the census continues to ask a binary sex question with options male or female. Now, this is a compulsory question. You have to answer it. And it kind of highlights how on the surface, something that presents itself as being inclusive for some people doesn't work for everyone. For non-binary people, for example, who may not identify as male or female, selecting a binary sex option was compulsory. So my point here is that the design of data collection tools, even those that present themselves as being inclusive, can sometimes ensure that particular characteristics or particular ways of thinking about identity are designed out of the process. So with the census, while some LGBTQ people are now counted, the design of data collection tools or particular ways of being or living remained hidden from view. So some kind of communities are brought into spotlight, while some other communities are pushed further into the shadows. Now, some of my research looks at what's happening in kind of digital spaces, particularly things like fitness apps, health apps, dating apps, is a kind of focus of my research. And I'm interested in what happened in the mid-2010s and early 2020s, how these apps and technologies added more options for gender and sexuality. You can see on the screen some of the more kind of high-profile examples where there was more options made available for these characteristics. For example, one dating app I explore in my book called Field reports that in 2024, over half of their members who identify as heterosexual connect with people on the app who do not. And Field has reported that over 180,000 people change their sexuality during the first year of using the app, and that the longer Field members are on the app, the less heterosexual they get. However, speaking with researchers Carolina Bandinelli and Alessandro Gandini, Sandra, who's a 35-year-old dating app user living in the UK, exclaimed, "The algorithm is not getting me right. See what matches it gives me. Do you think I am that kind of person?" I like to share this example because it highlights that something still isn't working. So these technologies, these apps, these ways of counting have added more and more and more options, but it's still not working for everyone. Looking more widely, it also won't come as a surprise when I say something just seems broken with our current approaches to data and policy, particularly around the classification of gender, sex, and sexuality. The solution, add more LGBTQ people, has failed, and I think it's failed because data is political. It has a politics, and these approaches haven't meaningfully engaged with the politics of data. Numbers and categories across the UK have become a real kind of political kind of discussion point in recent years, and how the seemingly mundane topic of how we count, categorize, and manage categories of gender and sex has become one of the key battlegrounds around LGBTQ equalities. Now, I'm not being over the top today when I say that this debate, this discussion, this area of work has become a key issue in the fight for equalities, particularly for trans, non-binary and queer people. And in today's political climate, we can see how repeatedly data about LGBTQ communities is used and weaponized in ways to cause harm on these communities. This is an area of my research. I'm not going to go into too much detail about it in the call today, but just thinking through how data about gender, sex, and sexuality can be used in ways to try and erase marginalized groups, particularly trans people, from existing in data, law, and policy, and how this has become a key strategy of the UK's anti-trans movement, something I describe in my work as trans exclusionary data activism. So today, having kind of set out that context, I want to propose an alternate approach. We're not just going to be adding more and more people into our data systems. We're going to be trying something different. And I call that a queer data approach. So this new plan of action is kind of outlined in my first book, Queer Data, where I describe queer data as consisting of two strands. So the quick 101 on queer data, it's got two strands, and the first one is data about LGBTQ communities, and secondly, asking questions about or querying the methods we use to collect, analyze, and present all types of data. So it may or may not relate to LGBTQ communities. This second strand, I think, is more interesting, and it complements and challenges some of our assumptions about data when it comes to identity characteristics. Because this second strand asks questions about methods, it makes us think about the politics, the history, and the power of policymakers, practitioners, funders, and researchers. So we're really moving our focus away from thinking about the groups we're investigating, in my case, LGBTQ communities, and instead moving that spotlight to think about us, actually thinking reflexively about what do we bring to these projects, how do we inform and shape the research and the work that we do. A queer data approach does not presuppose the need for more or better data, and that might seem strange, I'm sure, for many of you on the call. In fact, this approach highlights how efforts to accumulate more and more and more data can, in some situations, inflict harm upon the communities we're trying to help. So a queer data approach tells a different story. It sits in a broader space of kind of around critical approaches to data, critical data studies. It tells a different story. And while acknowledging that data can do some good, I wouldn't be doing this job if I thought otherwise, it also highlights how these easy fixes, these easy assumptions, don't necessarily get at the root cause of the problems we face in our work. Okay, what I want to do in the final kind of part of my talk today is shift my focus from thinking about big ideas, concepts, theory, to actually think more practically, how might we go about adopting a queer data approach in our work going forward? So hopefully here there's some tips and tricks for things you can do in your work in this space. And I'm going to present this as kind of 4 queer questions, 4 prompts for you to be thinking about in your research and work going forward. And the first question that we should all be asking, whatever we're working on, whether it's data on gender, sex, and sexuality, or data on any topic, is actually, do we need more data? And I'm sure many in the room are familiar with the demand that we need more data. I sit on several EDI committees, boards, groups, and there'll always be somebody at the table who says we need more data about X, Y, and Z. And while this can do some good in some situations, you've probably guessed from my talk so far that I don't believe accumulating more and more data is going to be the answer to all of our problems. Here I turn particularly to the work of an amazing sociologist based in the US who does work around racial injustice. Her name's Ruha Benjamin, and she argues that the problem here is not a lack of knowledge, and that demanding data on subjects we already know much about is actually a perversion of knowledge. So if we actually have an evidence base of that problem already, why are we demanding more and more data about it? 2 other scholars also based in the US who I routinely turn to because they do amazing work on this topic, and that is Catherine D'Ignacio and Lauren F. Klein, who wrote a brilliant book a few years ago called Data Feminism. And they argue how data accumulated tends to focus on problems as removed from a more rounded account, looking at strengths, creativity, and agency. And for D'Ignacio and Klein, they argue that minoritized groups and individuals should not have to repeatedly prove that their experiences of oppression are real. So I'm going to kind of end each of these mini sections with a queer question, just something for you to think about in your work, a prompt in your research, in your practice. And just think whether or not more data about LGBTQ lives will necessarily improve the experiences of LGBTQ communities. Okay, that's the first queer question. Second queer question is, what happens across time and space? I'm really interested in kind of the temporal dimensions of data and how the need to collect identity data kind of does strange things in terms of freezing people's identity in this particular moment. However, we know this is often not the case. I mentioned in a previous life, I was a kind of historian for a brief period of time, and we know that looking at identity characteristics across time, they change. So actually what it means to identify as disabled in 2026 is different from 1976 or 1776. But also within the research participants in our studies, their identity characteristics are also changing. So the fluidity of identity means that data collected about a community or population can change in a relatively short period of time. So we have to think in our data practices, how can we kind of make sense of the temporal dimension of data? Also related here is that data has a history. Data is something historical. It tells us something about the past. However, the historical distribution of data is not equal. Two amazing researchers working in the space are Jenja Giesking and Shaq McLaughlin, and they both described how for LGBTQ communities, most historical data has only been used to stigmatize and to pathologize. And this has contributed to a lack of quality existing data about LGBTQ people. I'm not going to go down a side path around AI and large language models, but we see some of those same tensions around data having a history and how that's having knock-on repercussions for how LGBTQ communities are represented in kind of AI technologies today. So in queer data, I argue that those working with data need to defrost assumptions. We need to kind of think through how can we move against this approach of freezing in time and space data about identity. Okay, so the second queer question we should all be asking is whether our practices, our methods and approaches are presenting communities as something fixed in time and space. Okay, queer question number 3. Do you need to be out to be counted? This one's really interesting for me and kind of my current area of work. I'm writing a few pieces on kind of this idea of being out and whether you have to be out in order to be counted. Because positioned at the intersection of data and identity is this thorny question of disclosure and the contexts that make it possible or impossible to share information about who you are and how you identify. Many data systems can only make sense of LGBTQ individuals who are out. So an open declaration of sexuality or gender identity has become part of the price of entry. Now, while this requirement might seem progressive, workplaces, organizations, funders where everyone is out, it might not be desirable or possible for everyone in all spaces and places. In previous research, I was looking at what was happening in the UK film and TV industries. I'm particularly looking at how kind of workplace metrics, diversity monitoring forms were counting and categorizing different workspaces. And there were strange things happening in some of these film and TV companies. You can see on the screen data from the BBC that shows its current workforce composition and then a target it had set for a year's time. And myself and my colleague who were looking at this thought, what's up here? Why is the BBC kind of predicting to cut the number of LGBTQ staff it employs? And the reason around that was issues around numerical overrepresentation. And for anyone who can't see me, I'm doing air quotes here. This idea that a target group is kind of numerically overrepresented. So when compared to something like the census, there are too many of one group or one population in a particular space. On the screen, I brought up that data I shared earlier, and you can see how there's some kind of ethical problematic things that might unfurl from these types of counting exercises, where this idea of benchmarking or kind of comparing and contrasting actually might create situations where we see numerical overrepresentations of certain minoritized groups. In the case of the BBC, they moved to something different. They then moved to something we describe as an outness metric, where they're trying to kind of set as a target, as a kind of indicator, the number of colleagues at that organization who are out in the workplace. Again, we thought this also doesn't work. This is also ethically quite problematic, this idea of trying to get people out and kind of attaching that to a key performance indicator was not a path that we think organizations should be going down. So my third queer question is just thinking about outness. What does it mean to be out, to disclose information, whether it's about gender, sex, sexuality, disability, religion, belief, ethnicity, that moment of being out or disclosing information about who you are. Okay, I'm going to squeeze in one final question at the end of my talk, and it's a bit of a controversial one. I like to end things with a bit of a kind of interesting vignette, and that is around the question whether it's always good to be included. So my work sits in a space actually quite critical of some approaches to inclusion or some easy, quick ideas about what it means to be inclusive. And particularly what happens when we think about that in terms of data or being included in different data projects and data systems. There's a slide I like to share because it shows that inclusion is just one of many possible objectives we can be trying to achieve, whether in our research, in our practice, in our kind of organizational work. Inclusion can sometimes be a stepping stone to something else, something bigger, or inclusion can sometimes be an endpoint. So the objective is to kind of be included in an organization. Now, although data practices are not often mentioned in the space, in my area of research and scholarship, which is around kind of gender, sexuality, kind of queer studies, there is quite a long history of work of people thinking critically about what it means to be included. Actually, what are the dangers and risks of being brought into systems, institutions, ways of working that can often be quite harmful for those communities being brought in. My point here is that inclusion in data marked a new frontier in this kind of co-opting, this bringing in of historically marginalized and minoritized groups and communities into data systems and into data sets. So finally, my fourth and final queer question is just thinking about inclusion and whether inclusion in systems, institutions, methods is really the best we can do. Is that what we really want to be striving for? Okay, I'm going to bring things to an end now and kind of pull together these threads from my talk today and just think, why does any of this matter? You've given up an hour of your day to listen to me talk about this kind of my research, my work. Why is this relevant? Why is this important? Well, nobody wants to be the killjoy at the party, but when we talk about inclusive approaches to data, we have to think about the good and the bad. As the writer Travis Alabanza observes, all categorization has achieved is the creation of more boxes around gender to fit us within, rather than being a tool to smash the rigidness of those boxes. So I want to conclude by reminding you of those queer questions to be asking. Do you need more data? What happens across time and space? Do you need to be out to be counted? And fourthly, is it always good to be included? So in terms of takeaways, there are the 4 questions we should all be asking in our research, in our practice going forward. I also want us to keep in mind the many lives and individuals who fall between the categorical cracks, and how by saying no to the choices presented, you're not just being awkward or difficult, but you're actually challenging the narrowness of the rules made available to you. And for those who had their hands in the air at the top of my talk, all you box breakers in the call, by existing as a box breaker, your unwillingness to align to existing classifications means that you are disrupting the system simply by existing. And you're exposing the entire design of these data sets, these classification rules, these institutions, they're designed as a charade. So I'm going to bring things to an end, and I imagine many on the call today will have seen, maybe some have recognized or empathized with some of the examples I've shared on the call today. While I'm sure there might also be people joining us today who are brand new to this topic, maybe less familiar with this area of work, and maybe think that some of what I've shared is maybe a bit overblown or maybe no big deal. So to that latter group, I just always ask them to imagine how it feels when you're assigned to a category not of your choosing, and when membership of that category, when the box that you're put into closes doors that should be open. Because all categories are qualified and contingent on the whims of who decides. So my ask for you all in your research, in your practice, is that you build data systems, you build research, you build areas of work for those also who subvert and those who choose to refuse, and that you build for the box breakers. Thank you. And I'm also going to finish with a plug for my book. As I mentioned, it came out in paperback last week. So if anything in the talk has kind of spiked interest in this topic, please feel free to grab a copy from indie bookstores, queer bookstores, or also online. You can grab a copy for about £10, £11. I'm looking forward to a discussion, and thanks again for the invite to join you to share my work today.